I'm honored to give the floor to Martin Laba. Do you hear me properly, Martin?
I do, loud and clear, perfectly,
Great,
forcefully, authoritatively. Yes.
great. So, Martin, thank you for being here. Martin, for everybody, is the Associate Director of the School of Communication at Fraser University. His research includes applied communication for social issues, media education, critical studies in education and digital media technology, popular media and popular culture, pedagogical design, and communication for social change. So, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Roberta. Much appreciated, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I second my SFU colleague from before of thanking the organizers and the constant and conscientious uh, communiques I and we all receive from Andrea. So it's always a pleasure. I'll just say that I'm probably going to give a perspective that's a little different. Let me say that I'll challenge techno optimism and techno utopianism in terms of post pandemic education. And I'll also warn you that my slides are picture heavy and text light. It's a philosophy I have. So the few slides will be pictures mostly. So just so you can anticipate it. Um, all right. Sorry, the screen just went. There we go. So I'll start with a techno-optimism or techno-utopian discourses and ideologies that have driven and absolutely sustained surges of technology into everyday life over many, many decades. In the contemporary iteration of this technological optimism, all public resources, education, healthcare, governmental organizations, and much more are reimagined as ideally and ultimately technologically integrated. And as such, and such integration is regarded always as ameliorative, especially as we move toward a post-pandemic world. For some, such as former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, the seamless and comprehensive integration of technology into every dimension of civic life is a critical foundation and future direction for post-pandemic recovery. Among Schmidt's first priorities, as he calls them, is remote learning. For others, such as well-known Canadian social critic and philosopher and activist Naomi Klein, such systematic privatization of public resources is an enormously problematic trajectory that speaks of the domination and the logic of capitalized technology. Klein conjures up a, quote, future being rushed into being, consonant with emerging contactless ideology and enabling technologies because, as asserted, chillingly asserted by Sphere Tech CEO Anuja Senalkar, quote, humans are biohazards and machines are not. A consideration of the direction of educational design and delivery post-pandemic must necessarily begin with this broader question of our absolute faith in the corrective capacities of technological solutions, a long-established historical faith. More specifically, our emerging perspectives on the so-called return to normal are deeply inflected with our experiences and, more to the point, our students' experiences of an entirely online learning environment. The questions that arise frame this analysis. First, to what extent has the great remote experience been instructive, even determining in terms of technologically based educational practices in the future? And second, how do such future-facing practices articulate our most important educational philosophies towards citizenship, civic engagement, and broad and sustained social change? This is the business of education, in my mind. These are not simple questions of technological infrastructures and operations, although irrefutably, these were questions which dominated our frantic search for online platforms and other resources in extraordinarily daunting circumstances at the beginning of the pandemic. It is, of course, understandable that both early and continuing responses to educational lockdown would be a strategy of technological invention and technological application. In particular, what we saw mostly was business conferencing platforms adapted to teaching and learning environments. However, in the urgencies to find and adapt technology in a compressed time frame, the contemplation of our educational philosophies was neither concomitant nor priority. The urgency was to get students' terms and semesters to the finish line, even with just a hint of academic legitimacy. But emergency and thoughtful educational philosophy are hardly compatible. There's a big picture to consider. The ubiquity, priorities, and the authority of technology in the quotidian life of education are irrefutable, and the vision of post-pandemic teaching and learning environments and the economic determinants compelling such vision are inextricably tied to technological solutions. As we proceed with trepidatious but urgent direction toward near future educational policies and pedagogical practices, a near and in fact long-term future of education through technological design and operation, we would do well to heed Edward Hamilton's argument that, quote, a sound understanding of online education cannot be reached by asking only how technologies work or by the abundance of devices. Indeed, as Hamilton points out, online education cannot be understood outside of highly charged debates, cannot be understood outside of these highly charged debates on the role and the politics of education in society. As technology was evangelized as the key to educational reform at the end of the 1990s, there are unmistakable resonances with imaginings of post-pandemic education recovery and revision. The brave new world of education promised by proponents of online teaching and learning at that time in the 90s emphasized the need for entrepreneurial initiative and competitive edge on the part of universities as they necessarily prepared for and entered the emerging and expansive markets of virtualized education. The traditional bricks and mortar university was seen as a fossil, critiqued as a fossil, woefully lacking the vision and resources to accelerate toward a future in which education and industry were increasingly integrated for advantage in the then transformation toward what was called, as you'll remember, the global information or knowledge economies. And online education was the leading edge of educational reform in this view, an answer for financially distressed educational institutions, administrations, governments seeking solutions to receding budgets, the managerial demands of accountabilities and measurable outcomes, oversubscribed courses, crowded classrooms, and expanding marketplaces of education and educational technology providers and developers, and more. These are not distant historical details, but rather clear and direct calls in prescriptions for current post-pandemic education. As Eric Schmidt asks, quote, how could the emerging technologies being deployed in the current crisis propel us into a better future? And of course, we all know this equation between technological future and techno-optimism that is part of this, long been part of this discourse. His specific reference to education is critical to his vision of integrative technology at a societal scope, no less. As he argues that we should, quote, accelerate toward the trend toward remote learning where there is, and this is key to the vision, no requirement for proximity. The corporatization and digitization of the modern university remains a flashpoint for debate and contestation, as well it should. Critical perspectives have long regarded online education as a lever for economic rationalization of higher education, as Hamilton notes. In substantive and expansive terms, these perspectives have argued that education is increasingly commodified and automated as the digitized university is ongoingly transformed in the powerful determinants of neoliberal economistic and administrative models, policies, and priorities. In simple terms, technologies have been developed, applied to maximize revenues and minimize instructional expenditures, which, of course, as Stephen Mintz has put it, is the holy grail of educational cost cutting. As a consequence, enabling technologies for comprehensive online delivery and numerous variants of teaching at scale erode educational and institutional autonomy and diminish the values, the principles, and the practices of education as a critical and open public good, as an instigator and a custodian for democratic process and progress. A pedagogical foundation in the achievement of the democratic core of education and the timeless value, at least since Plato, of higher education is conversation, dialogue among human bodies in a room engaged in real-time, unmediated exchange of ideas and opinions. This is embodied education, rich and immediate, open and dynamic, nuanced and complex, counter-authoritarian at its core, and is a dramatic contrast to the distance, the mediation, the dispassion, what have some referred to as the ultimate indifference of technological platform teaching. Consequential pedagogy should be the goal of all educators. By consequential, I mean educational values, pedagogical design and practice, teaching and learning environments, and institutional priorities that need to be driven by the principles and the goals of democratic education and the achievement of citizenship. At its essence, citizenship is the most ennobling mission of our universities, the achievement of ethicality, of compassion, of engagement, of civic fortitude, motivated by a recognition that educational purpose is in fact sustained social change. The provocations and contestations around the design and application of technology, whether advocacy for and endorsement of expanded online delivery, or critical and admonitory of the perils of technological and economic priorities, are instructive as we set directions and parameters for post-pandemic education. There is abundant, and that's an understatement, evidence of student dissatisfaction with remote delivery, which, as Joseph noted in the chat earlier on, must be, and I responded, must be distinguished from online and distance learning, which is structured and designed specifically for that purpose. Space does not permit a detailed account of the global survey data. I cite two Canadian surveys, one from the Canadian Confederation of University Faculty Associations and the other from Abacus Data, both situated in Toronto. The dissatisfaction, the surveys that are cited are examples that typify student responses across numerous post-secondary institutions and around the globe. The dissatisfaction with remote learning among students offers us a direction forward in post-pandemic return to normal circumstances. On its own, contactless education is unviable. It works against the principles and the practices of experiential learning, authenticity, immediacy, and consequential pedagogy as I've defined it. As responses of students and faculty instructors made demonstrably clear in one of the Canadian studies, students and faculty feel that the, quote, adjustments to course delivery and campus life compelled by the onset of COVID-19 pandemic have had an overall negative impact on the quality of education and students' general educational experience, unquote. A lack of interaction, engagement, and communication, as well as social isolation and stress, were cited as the key factors in this negative experience. And again, the data is overwhelming. Technology has long been an article of faith in education, with dizzying promises concomitant with the ongoing elaborations of digital culture and the ever-expanding aspirations and applications of virtual education. The argument here is not meant, it is not meant as a blanket critique of digital learning, not at all, or the enabling possibilities of its accelerated technologies, which in the form of conferencing platforms delivered us from the education-related calamities of the pandemic. Instead, it's a call for vigilance, for action in the expansion of, in what is inevitably the expansion of digital education, and a case for the critical qualities of richness, depth, of face-to-face context of communication, contexts that are the foundation and the lubricant of democratic education. The overarching questions of educational philosophy, the activism of students, the pursuit and achievement of ethicality, compassion, and civic engagement, the design of learning environments and pedagogical practices that promote and sustain autonomy, student independent thinking and critical thinking, self-direction above all, and much more. All are paramount concern and consideration, and never more so than in a moment when remote delivery and mediated learning have gained their greatest authority and appeal as economic efficiencies. In education, there should be no return to normal ever. Rather, post-pandemic needs to be a moment for revision, and such revision needs to articulate, sustain, and elaborate the values and the practices of democratic education. This is a moment for renewal and expansion of face-to-face learning and teaching environments, supported by technological adjuncts, but never defined by the fact of technological enablement. This is a moment when students need to acquire their sense of agency, their capacities of creativity, and to hone their collaborative instincts and skills, and to do so demands self-direction cultivated in embodied education. Thank you. I'm ready to take questions, of course. There are questions.
Martin, many thanks for this very interesting presentation. Really.
Thank you.
So, please, if you guys have questions, just open your microphone or type in the chat, because I'm sure there are quite a few, because the presentation was very interesting.
There's certainly many comments in the chat, which I appreciate.
I see quite a few.
Sorry. Yeah. Here's
one question from you, Suk.
It's a good question. Well, all the questions are good questions. This one is interesting, particularly for me, because we are desperately looking for directions to remedy the problem. And the problem is a broader problem around what I describe as a context within which contemporary universities find themselves. It is irrefutable that university administrations and governments that fund those administrations here provincially are salivating with the delicious prospects of cost cutting, because such approaches to remote learning, and again I'm distinguishing from Joseph's important description of the difference between remote learning, which we were all thrust into, and mostly inelegantly, and online education, which is completely different. And he has an elaboration in the chat about that. But what we really need to do is to balance what is without a doubt, and it's not uncritical, it's very critical, and it's informed, an embrace of all things technological, the discourse of techno-optimism and techno-utopianism, as I've described it. And we've got to get much more critical about this. We have to understand that celebrating the creativity, which we heard from our very first presenter, and a really important and compelling argument, is something we really need to delve into even more. However, my argument here is that we always need to strive to a balance. And this is in response to how students actually responded to remote learning during the pandemic. Their experience of it wasn't positive by any means generally. There were positive responses, of course, but by and large, the abundant evidence that I mentioned is clear. So if the argument is that the remedy is to stick to our pedagogical philosophies and our practices and our principles that ensure that first and foremost, this university is a site of citizenship, no matter what the discipline is, and that we have to engage with students to the best of our ability in what will inevitably be a blend, as always, in our teaching practices of online with face-to-face. And my passionate, I suppose, or impassioned argument is not in the prospects and the promises and the optimism of technological development and the technological trajectories that are clearly a part of contemporary educational practices post-pandemic. Let's do a proper political and economic critique and understand what is motivating there. And two, as I said, not a blanket condemnation or critique even of online education, just the opposite. It's a call for balance, and that's the remedy forward. Good critical perspective on the political economy of the university, and to challenge our students to say, what we're doing, what's at stake in your university education is nothing less than the health and the well-being and the progress of democratic society. That's how important these questions are. We cannot lose which shouldn't be understood as platonic ideals. They're they were, but they're very much alive and very active in this debate. So sorry for the long-winded response, but it was a really good question. You're welcome.
Yeah, I agree with the words that Debbie Marciano used, inspiring, definitely inspiring.
Thank you, Roberta, and thanks to Deb. Thank you for that.
Another question.
The question is why most of our students would wish traditional teaching. The responses in the data, again, are very clear. Students don't reject online learning, certainly not, or remote delivery necessarily. What they missed and what they felt cheated, and I use that word kind of metaphorically, but feel cheap, but what they felt deficient during the pandemic was the lack of contact. And it's not just with the instructor. As we all know as educators, that contact with the instructor is a part of, but certainly not the entire experience, the student experience. It's their contact with, their ongoing relationships with, their debates, their discussions with their peers, with other students, prompted by their instructors. So I think it's quite clear, and maybe it's sublimely human, that we need contact. That's why I argued, and the argument was that contactless education, as a complete concept, is unviable. It just doesn't work, and it's precisely because the students. When you say in the chat, traditional teaching, I'll just qualify that and say, no, not necessarily traditional. We've got to constantly invent, and in previous conferences here, I've described my own approaches, but I don't have time to do it now, to innovating and reinventing and revising constantly, almost every semester, are face-to-face contacts. So face-to-face is traditional. It's embodied teaching, as I say, but not traditional. In fact, just the opposite. Innovative, forward-facing, and bold, and frankly, taking chances to achieve what I said in the paper was what students actually need. Students, I see in the chat what they need as they articulate it. What I see in the chat is students felt betrayed that teaching took place mostly online. Really, and that's very true. This is a perspective from the UK, my perspective from Canada, but the work that I'm citing is in fact global. And so, yeah, there is something timeless and vitally important, decisive and consequential in that face-to-face context. It's been with us a long time. It's traditional in its delivery, I suppose, bodies in the same room, in discussion, debate, contested views and perspectives and opinions. But there should be nothing traditional about it, as in staid and undynamic. In fact, face-to-face contexts of communication need constant revision and innovation. And I believe that that's part of our commitment as we move forward.
Martin, many thanks for your great answer. Really, many thanks for your whole speech. And if you would like to type your email even on the public chat, because I am sure that our people that still are willing to ask you questions, but unfortunately we have to deal with the time. Okay.
There's my email. It's in the program too, I expect. I believe it is, but there it is. And I welcome all and every agreement or disagreement, any perspective at all. You know, true to the philosophy of education that we hold dear, which is respectful discussion and debate and so on. And so whatever your perspective, I'll be thrilled to hear from you. Next year in Firenze.
We really hope so. We really,
Roberta, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Great. Now, I would like to give the floor to Agnes. I'm now uploading